90% of people that I've spoken to don't know the toxic effects of cremated ashes on our soil. So, the two reasons why cremated remains are toxic for the environment are number one, pH. Cremated remains are very high. They're at an 11.8 on the scale, which is comparable to bleach mixed with the sodium content. So, one urn of a full body of cremated remains is actually equivalent to 2 cups of table salt. So, if you were to pour bleach and 2 cups of table salt into your garden where you are planting something that has a significant memorial tie to a loved one, I'm sure you can guess that that rose bush will not do well.
You're listening to the Behind the Village podcast. Our guest today is Lauren Andrew from Awake.
I think, the topic of death is so interesting because, it's one of those it makes me feel weird if I'm super honest about it. But at the same time, I don't know, it's something that's just part of life and it happens to everybody, like, the future client comment that you have.
But it's like nobody ever talks about it, right? Because everybody, I think, has at least I'm assuming a healthy dose of being afraid of dying. So just people don't talk about it, right? So just what do you do? How does it work?
Yeah.
How, like, when it happens and all that kind of stuff. So that's what was really interesting when we first kind of met you, was just hearing about all the things that Awake does, right? And everything that you guys are providing or looking to provide, and how different that appears to me from someone that has never kind of looked into it that much. Like, we're still, I guess, somewhat young, if you will,
Mhm.
but we've never actually kind of looked into that. But that sounds really interesting. I don't know if you kind of want to start with you telling us a little bit about what Awake is and what you guys sort of do.
Sure. Yeah, excited to dive into all of those things. I think over the past 3 to 4 years, we've had many conversations, and I'd say you two are definitely of the younger generation when it comes to talking about death. So I think that bodes well for the things that we can talk about today as to conversations and why some of us are still weird and leery about it. So excited. When it comes to Awake, I think the easiest way to describe what it is that we do is we have two very separate pillars that, although I say separate because they are basically two businesses on their own, but are also very interconnected. So that's why we talk about death in two very different ways. So one of them is that we do specialize in scattering gardens in memorial forests that turn ashes to earth. So we are very intrinsically tied to creating beautiful, affordable, and sustainable resting places, specifically for cremated remains. We work with cemeteries of all sizes. The closest cemetery to us is actually in Stayner at Stayner Union Cemetery, all the way down to Toronto St. James Cathedral, downtown Toronto, Hamilton, and Niagara. So those are the larger components of our product-based side of the business. So it's actually working with cremated remains and putting them to rest in an eco-friendly sense. The other side of the business is more geared towards spirituality. So we have a team of celebrants which work with people at all milestones of their life. So from baby blessings to weddings, and then our largest milestone, which is our celebrations of life and funeral services. So we act as the officiant in a lot of celebrations of life. So we work very closely with getting to know your story and the family story and that of all of the loved ones from someone that you've lost. So we are tactile in the way that we're actually working with industry on one side and then people on the other. So that's what we do at Awake.
That's really cool. There were a few things that were just my brain was pinging off of what you were saying, but you mentioned in terms of, the scattering gardens, and for me personally, I've always felt that, this is my own personal belief for my own physical self, but to be able to go back into the earth, is like I've always talked about being a tree
Yeah.
or like a bush, or like put me back into nature. And I know quite a few people, scattering remains is something that a lot of people feel connected to in terms of how they wanna rest, at the end. But, you mentioned kind of the eco-friendly aspect of it. So, what does that mean? Like, in terms of just the typical ash scattering, is that not eco-friendly? Like, is there
Yeah, so I will get into this and I will preface this by saying that I am one of two. So, my co founder, Amanda, and I are the ones that work heavily on this business. And we have coined the term that she is the books and I am the boots. So, she is definitely more heavily into the science piece. So, I did write some notes to make sure that I'm not giving any incorrect information. But yes, so what you have mentioned that I'd say the majority, like 80% of people, maybe even 90% of people that I've spoken to don't know the toxic effects of cremated ashes on our soil health and plant health. So although I will state this for everyone who's ever performed a scattering or thinking of doing so, that cremated remains are completely safe to touch. There's nothing that can happen to you when you're actually dealing with cremated remains. The toxicity happens when those remains are then tried to be put to earth. So whether you're scattering them on the ground or if you're burying them in a memorial garden or if you're putting them into soil of some kind. So the reasons for that is that cremated remains are not ashes, although we all like to use the term ashes, and I'm trying to be very careful because I know the industry doesn't like us to use the term ashes. But they're not ashes, whereas ashes from a fire or if after you are at camping, those will go back and they'll do nothing to the planet besides help create new life in the future, hopefully. But with us, cremated remains are actually sterilized bone matter. So, from a science lens, keeping this high level, there are 2 reasons why. I know I always sound like Amanda, "Tell it to me slow." Right? "Give
I
it
know.
to me
I know.
so that."
I need to understand as
Right?
well.
Yeah, "Give it
Yeah.
to me so I can talk to my parents about it." So, the 2 reasons why cremated remains are toxic for the environment are, number 1, pH. So, cremated remains are very high. They're at an 11.8 on the scale, which is comparable to bleach, which is at a 12. So, the pH level is extremely high, mixed with the sodium content. So, 1 urn of a full body of cremated remains is actually equivalent to 2 cups of table salt. So for people that garden or maybe don't, you can pretend that you do. If you were to pour bleach and 2 cups of table salt into your garden where you are planting something that has a significant memorial tie to a loved one, I'm sure you can guess that that rose bush, that tree, that sapling, anything that you grow flowers from that area will not do well. So, on our product side of the business, we have a patented soil amendment, which is basically fun, long words to say we have a wonderful soil product that the ingredients that we use will neutralize the pH levels and help strain the sodium away from where you've put it into the ground so that it's away from the root systems of plants. And it also introduces a cultural or a bacterial culture to the cremated remains that will help it break down the minerals that are once sterilized and paused in the cremation process so that they can actually come back to earth. So when you mention things like want to go back to nature, want to become that tree that your family can visit, so many people think the same as you. Amanda and myself being one of them, and that's why we started Awake so that we can help the 70 plus percentage of Canadians who choose cremation, whether that's for religious and cultural reasons, whether that's affordability, whether that's because that's the easiest thing for them to have access to in their area. And then, even though they've chosen cremation, they can still have a green option when it comes to actually deciding on the interment after disposition. So sorry, that was a lot of words everywhere.
No, it's really interesting though.
Yeah, that is super interesting to be able to
Yeah,
understand just the fact that what most people do, what we always have assumed that is just normal, because it's
yeah,
like you said, right? When you are, putting a fire out and stuff, on your backyard or doing something like that, there's ashes, you just assume, like, that nothing wrong comes with it, right? But putting that in perspective that these are actual remains, right, that comes with all of the things that whatever we are made of, right? Drastically changes the soil level, the pH and the acidity and all these kinds of things, it's I've never thought about it, but it makes sense once you start thinking about it.
well, yeah, because we're We are bodies.
Yeah, no, exactly, and it kind of all stems right back to the first things that both of you brought up is the fact that nobody knows these things because nobody talks about death. So I think that it kind of all stems back to the conversation. Well, number 1, it was probably not the thing that our science teachers were teaching us in high school, in elementary school. And it goes right back to how powerful words can be, right? A normal person on the street will just say, "Oh, it's grandma's ashes in the urn." Well, it's grandma's cremated remains. It's not ash. Ash, cremated remains, 2 completely different things. So, yeah, it's everyone that we've ever spoken to, besides people in the industry or scientists or those that work in landscaping, who have a far better understanding of the science, would just be like, "Oh, would have never guessed that when I put the stuff in the backyard, that's the reason why I've had to change the rose bush 3 times," right? So,
Mhm.
yeah.
And, just the amount of people that do it now, just in general, right? Create remains. I saw a video the other day where somebody was scattering the remains by like going skydiving and then just kind of opening
Yep.
and doing that kind of thing. But it happens so often. Like we are scattering remains all over the place. And like we're adding, 2 cups of salt and bleach. Do
Yeah, no, and you bring up a really good point too, where technically there's so many of us that are deciding once you've decided cremation, right? That's a disposition choice. It's a burial or cremation. There's a few other options that are out there in the market too, but for the purposes of this conversation and the fact that I'm the boots and not the books, we'll state cremated remains. Um, Once you get your loved one back, whether that's in an urn or a box or whatever that looks like, there's no telling where these loved ones end up. And we're not even talking about pets, right? So when we looked at the stats last, 1 in 5 homes, I'm gonna say in Ontario, could have been a larger, actually it might have been in the all of Canada or the United States, but 1 in 5 homes on average have remains of a loved one in that home. And that doesn't include pets, because I can tell you for sure my parents have like 6 pets at their
Yep.
house just in an urn somewhere. So whether they just continually get passed down generation to generation and they're still on the mantle or wherever they've gone, we don't have record of that, right? There is no record as to, there's one they're all going to Algonquin Park and that's where they're scattering all the ashes, right? Like we have no idea where people are choosing to do their interments after unless they've chosen a cemetery, which the record keeping is there. So, yeah, you're right. We have no idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's where kind of a weight comes in. You said you're creating these places, these cemeteries where people are able to inter the cremains in a sustainable way. What does that mean specifically for those places that that you
Yeah. So the what I will say is all of our partners, cemetery partners across Ontario and across Canada for that matter, are awesome. Like they're here and they're listening to what it is that their client families want, and client families want something green. And they're also looking for I'm not to say everyone, but there are a large population looking for something that's a little less traditional when you think of a cemetery. They're looking for a place where they don't feel like you discussed earlier, like that ick or that weird feeling that overcomes you when you go to a cemetery. They wanna be able to come walk their dog, have a picnic, sit there, read a book, and have life enjoyed beside a loved one that is no longer there. So, circling that back to the cemeteries and how we help is number 1, I will say scattering gardens is not like a new concept. It's existed for a very long time and for some cemeteries. We're just helping them do this in a more sustainable way. So we're working with cemeteries to either create net new, what we like to call infinity gardens by a wake, where the entire garden is made up of our soil amendments. So every single time an interment happens, between 3 to 5 years, those cremated remains have gone completely back to earth, which is an awesome feeling that you know that your loved one is now providing energy to the world around them. So these scattering gardens, because the nature of the soil amendment will help bring the remains back to earth, you could technically use that garden in perpetuity forever and ever as long as we keep topping up. So when you look at potential land use issues with cemeteries, right? Like, there's this whole conversation about the real estate for the dead. We don't have it at top of mind here in Canada because we have so much space. But you look at a lot of countries in Europe where even if you decided to go through a traditional burial, you're leasing that space for X number of years before your loved one is unfortunately taken out, more than likely cremated anyways, so that they can use that space for somebody else. So we have to find ways to better use our land. Scattering gardens are a way to do that. But the traditional one is that scattering garden has a capacity, just like that 1 acre of land has a capacity. So we're helping them with infinite capacity. That also will help the price for client families to be able to afford to use those spaces. And then hopefully, as many cemeteries are starting to look into, is how can we make this space more naturalized? So, like you discussed, instead of having a garden, for example, the hope is one day there'll be memorial forests everywhere where you're picking a tree on your favorite trail. And it's not so confined to the mowed lawns and the manicured gardens, but you have that option. But there's also the option to decide on a lookout point or something that kind of fits more to who that loved one was when they were here or just how you connect to them. So that's what we do is we help basically provide choice for those who want to be in a traditional cemetery and know that the records are going to be there. They know exactly where, grandma was laid to rest. There can be markers. Or those who decide, we loved to hike or camp with grandpa. So let's go to the provincial park because it is legal to do so on crown land and scatter his ashes in an eco-friendly way with "Awake, Let Your Love Grow," and then know for sure that we're not damaging the place that he loved to go to so much.
Yeah, that's super cool.
That's
That
pretty amazing.
yeah, that resonates with what I want, is I've always the idea of being useful, like, I don't just wanna be, like, shoved in the ground and then I'm taking up s like you said, taking up space, like, that whole process is just for me, doesn't suit who I am. I'm trying not to put people down that choose it, but it's not doesn't vibe with my what I want.
But it's also something that, to what you said, Lauren, that I thought was really interesting was the idea of having life around where it happened, right? A cemetery is usually when you go, it's usually very sad, or you go there to, like moment of silence or do something like that. But it's all very quiet. It's all like, it's all land as far as you can see, right? Or it's like you're in the middle of a bunch of other people interred in there, and you're surrounded by that feeling that this is around death, right?
Yeah,
You're surrounded by that concept of like this is where the dead go. But to actually instead think about like, oh, we're going to a hike and this is where grandpa was
yeah.
was scattered. Like I'm visiting grandpa and it's like it's happy. Like
Mhm.
it's a, I'm in the middle of the forest or I'm in the middle of somewhere, there's a playground or I can walk my dog. Like it just feels
Absolutely.
more natural. It's
Yeah,
just
more organic, yeah, more natural for sure.
yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think, like, that's I constantly use the terminology where it's like we're bringing life back to death. I was lucky so my dad's Ukrainian and my mom's Chinese. So, the traditions are very different on both sides. Thankfully, being in Canada, we're surrounded by all these different types of traditions, specifically surrounding death, which I just find extremely interesting, and being second generation of both of those sides, I have the luxury of picking and choosing what parts of both of my parents' backgrounds, most connect to me. So that's the one thing, right? Like you guys are both looking for what connects to you. So in how we celebrate on the Chinese side is something called Qingming, which is referred to as Tomb Sweeping Day. And there's many different cultures who have something very similar to this. And ours is in in April with spring. And every year we go and visit our grandparents at a traditional cemetery in Toronto. And we buy only their favorite food. We light incense and we set up a picnic blanket and we sit there and we eat and we talk for a couple hours and we go get dinner. Like it's something I've done my entire life. And my husband, who's Canadian for I don't know how many generations, when he started coming around, he's like, "This is wicked."
Yeah.
He's like,
Mhm.
"I wish I grew up with this, coming to the cemetery and not feeling a heavy like you said, like a heavy weighted blanket and not sure if the my volume's too loud, or if I'm smiling too much to be here, or if I even should be sitting here and reminiscing when maybe I should just be doing this from home. So we've talked a lot with, I say we, Amanda and I have had these conversations a lot with cemetery industry, because I don't like to talk about death too much as a business, but it is, right? And there's reasons why cemeteries charge the prices that they do, so that they can upkeep, maintain records, and have a beautiful space for you to honor your loved ones, right? So we're at a crossroads now where there's people like the 2 of you and myself and millions of others who want to bring that life back to a place which was only viewed as a place of death. Because if you're able to provide a space, like even you said a playground, for example, I am waiting for a cemetery to install, nature play, so that when I bring my kids, it's not this uncomfortable place where we're visiting, Popo and Gong Gong. They can go there, they know the playground's there, and it's almost like they're enjoying the space while we visit. And there's many different ways of placemaking that already occur in, like, parks planning and things like that, that have a place in death, in bereavement. And I think we're at the beginning of some really cool and exciting things where we can have that as a part of our everyday, should that be something that we want, but like a beautification of these spaces that feel less restrictive as to how you can act. Of course, there's a respect component if there's a service going on beside you, regardless of where we are. Let's be respectful people. But, even in Hamilton at, one of our first scattering gardens, to sit there, we were doing some soil testing, and the number of people that were on a walk with their dog, on their usual jog, just there to read a book, they popped open their laptop and were doing work, like, it was incredible to see, because that is the life that should be associated with these spaces, right? It shouldn't be sad all the time.
I wanted to know how how did you get into this? Like, you and your partner because, it's as you said, there's millions of people that are kinda shifting their viewpoint into that, but to actually kinda take that step and think, like, it's Amanda's your partner, right?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, like, the 2 of you are just like, "Yeah, we wanna do this." Like, how did how did that happen?
Yeah, so, I have been in the event industry for the majority of my professional career, so that lended itself into the world of weddings, and during COVID, on the day Ontario shut down, which was March 16th, so congratulations, we
We
all
all
survived 5
remember.
years, right? We all remember
Yep,
that date. I
yep.
remember it even more because March 16th, 2020, at 12:10 AM, I gave birth to my first child. So, we went into the hospital and the world was one way, and we left the hospital and the world was completely different.
Nightmare.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it was one of those years for everybody where there's, like, a lot of internal reflection. I had decided, after waiting and pushing it off for many years, to actually become an ordained reverend with the Canadian International Metaphysical Ministry. For 2 reasons. I think at that point, I was really looking for something spiritual to help kind of uplift me into from a place where all of us were like, "What the heck is going on around us?" Right? And then in the business sense, it was like, "Oh, well, if I'm planning your wedding, I can also marry you now." Right? So, check off both of those boxes. Um, Come to realize that when you get to know your couples as intimately as you do when you're drafting their ceremony script, you know all about them, how they met, their family members, the intricacy of their relationship. 2 years down the line when, Uncle Tim passes away, the first thing they think of is, "Well, why don't we just get Lauren to do the ceremony? She knows all of us already." So that's how I was introduced to celebrations of life. When a colleague of mine that worked with both me and Amanda previous to COVID happening found out that this is what I was doing, she happened to have coffee with Amanda and told her, and Amanda's like, "Oh my god, we need to talk." She texted me immediately, was like, "I have this crazy idea. I feel like you would totally vibe with it. Let's talk." Turns out she's been doing research for the last year and a half during COVID because, all of us put on a different hat during
Mhm.
that
Yeah.
year and a
Yeah.
half time.
Yep.
Exactly.
And, she found a company in the States that we're now partners with, who have been working for 10 plus years on creating this soil amendment for cremated remains. So my and that's why I talk about our businesses being 2 separate entities and yet very much connected. I came from the ceremonial celebration side of death, and she came from science, and that's how Awake was born.
That's so cool.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot of things that you've talked about that I want to get into. I'm trying to, I guess, figure out what is the best way to get into this. What is, before I get too ahead of myself, what is a metaphysics minister? Like that term metaphysics is not something that I hear very often. So
Mhm.
I'm curious.
Yeah, so, in Ontario so I'll go back to how I chose, we call them CIMs, so Canadian International Metaphysical Ministry. When you are looking to legally like, perform a legal marriage in Ontario, aside from being a part of the clerk's office or justice of the peace, you have to be part of a recognized religious institution. So I spent 2 years finding one that sang to me, right? So I grew up Catholic. Um, it just I don't practice in that world anymore. There was lots of different there's, like, the humanist group. There's honestly, guys, there's a religion for everything, right? Yes. And then I found the Canadian International Metaphysical Ministry through a friend of mine who actually married my husband and I. He's like, "Look, you gotta join this group of people." So the religion itself is metaphysics. Without getting too much into it, from what I took out of my studies, is that the world around us is only what it is based off of our experience with everything in it. So I know that sounds a little silly. My favorite way that I described this to my husband was that they have this whole conversation in one of the lessons about a chair, right? So I only know what a chair is based off of what my parents told me a chair was, and then my experience with that chair, right? So I the biggest lesson I got from my studies with sim was taking those concepts to your personal relationships, right? So I only know what I know of you 2 based off of this interaction that I'm having with you right now, and then any other thing that someone else has told me, good, bad, or ugly, right? And we have to realize that it's our interpretation of these things, and we have to start removing and peeling back layers of information and ideas that don't necessarily pertain to our experience, removing the ego from
Mm.
that and getting to learn more about you based off of what you decide to tell me. So removing like the precursor information. Like I come in, they're like, that chair is for you to sit on. Whereas if no one told me that, I'd be like, huh, like I wonder what that chair could do, right? Or what it is. So that's my easiest take to kind of explain to you what I got from the metaphysical community. But what I love about our group as a whole is that we celebrate all denominations, right? We are not non-denominational. We are a religion, but we celebrate all things, just like we celebrate all love and we celebrate how everyone decides to celebrate these milestones in their life. So, we just take that spiritual component to it. We may or may not be the type of people that like to light an incense and rub a crystal every now and then, right? So, we're just here, it's about putting good energy out there and then removing all the extra stuff.
Which is so interesting because I would consider myself a non-religious person. I was never baptized or anything. My family's kinda Roman Catholic, like, Italian background, but my sisters and I were never really brought up with religion, and I don't consider myself religious in that way, but the idea of spirituality being different, I've always found interesting and, believe in the difference in that way and how you choose, like you mentioned, to practice or interact with religion or spirituality is fascinating. And, we got married without a religion backing us. It was very much go to the city,
Yes.
in the
Yeah.
paper,
Yeah.
but, like, that we didn't really know at the time that there were kinda other options in that way, and I think in terms of death and, celebrations of life, I think it's fascinating to bring that spirituality into that space as well, but maybe, there's probably quite a few people that perhaps like us, we don't necessarily identify with a single religion, so the idea of celebrating life is just kinda like, I don't know, I guess I guess tree? Like, what are my options?
Yeah, no, you bring up a valid point, and that's why I think that my experience with the Canadian International Metaphysical Ministry, without that, I don't think you'd be Awake would be where it is, because where I gather a lot of my learnings and teachings, and again, this is over the last 3 years too, is this exact conversation. Most people in Canada right now, definitely our generations, like, our parents are a little bit different. We are 100% more spiritual as a population than we've ever been before, but way less tied to a traditional religion, right? Which I think is great because, like with metaphysics, you should have the opportunity to pick and choose the things that you connect with in all areas of your life, right? So whether that's your wedding ceremony or when you look to pre-planning for, end of life or how you wanna celebrate the ones that you've lost during your life that are no longer here. The ability to pick parts of whether or not there's anything from the Roman Catholic side that you still connect with. If there's things that as a family you've decided is a tradition that has nothing to do or tie to any religion, or just the fact that, you acknowledge that you're not religious, you're not sure if you're spiritual, but you'd like to think that there's something else out there and you connect on an energetic level with that, then let's roll with that. And that's how we will come up with celebrations of life and service that make the most sense to each individual family because they're all thinking the same way as you. We're just like,
Uh-huh.
am I doing this right or wrong? And it's not about doing it right or wrong. It's about doing it in a way that you find peace and that people around you find peace.
I like that way of thinking quite a bit. Like the way that I connect with, because as you mentioned, for me personally, the way that I connect with, I guess, the spiritual sense of things, I don't consider myself religious, but I do like to keep that idea that, I like to follow what the world is trying to tell me. So whenever I am, something happens or an opportunity comes or, whatever, I usually think is like, what is the world trying to tell me? Like, I guess from that energy of the world, right? What is the world trying to tell me? Is it moving in a specific direction? Is it trying to do something? Is it, that I should maybe pay more attention to that I haven't been paying attention to before? That sort of thing. And I think um, we can have a whole other
I
conversation
know,
on
I
this.
know.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. But I think this sort of naturally takes us to another part that I was going to point out, which is the concept of tradition, right? We've already kind of touched on what a wake does in terms of the scattering gardens and helping the cemeteries kind of do a different way of helping and inter people. But the other side of Awake is also the celebrations and that kind of thing. So I'm curious about how tradition fits in with Awake, I guess, in that sense.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is when it comes to our client families, I think people find us because they truly either one of 2 things, have no traditions to lean on from previous experience, or 2, they just really do not connect with the traditions that have been used in the past. So, when it comes to celebrations of life, um, like, as a whole, I'd say 98% of our client families are the ones that don't belong to any type of organized religion, like, they're not part of a congregation already, they don't go to church on an ongoing basis. So, when it comes to the celebration of life, it's at a venue or it's at a private home because that's where either they felt most comfortable or their neighbor did it, right? So, they're like, "Oh, they use such and such, so we'll go do that too." Um, when it comes to tradition, I find that the families that I get a chance to talk to, and I'm sure Amanda would say the same, is we're actually helping them for the first time ever create tradition. So they'll think back to, and we're at an interesting time. I'm not sure if you 2 feel the same way, but I'm at an age now where all of a sudden it's like friends' parents, definitely friends' grandparents if we still have them, we're losing them, right? It's the generational gap now where we over the next 10 years, we'll see the most recorded death in or most deaths in recorded history. That's just because of the baby boomers. It's just a
Yeah.
Yeah.
simple mathematical fact. So when I sit back and talk to clients or just friends at the same age of me as me, they're like, the thought of having to go and do the same ceremony that we had when my grandmother died 10 years ago, literally every part of my body wants to just, right, fall apart, whether that's emotionally it didn't wasn't supportive of them at that time, or just the thought of it makes you roll your eyes, right? Like, some people are like, "Oh my god, if I have to eat another egg salad sandwich cut into a triangle, I'm gonna lose my
Oh,
mind," right?
yeah.
So, what we kind of talk about, hopefully I'm not belaboring this, is that traditions don't need to be like this huge, crazy thing where it's like we say this huge, poem at every ceremony for everyone in our family, and then we light, 150 incense like they did at my grandfather's funeral where my eyes were watering for 4 days afterwards. And we had to have this massive viewing, like, no, who was your mom? What's your number 1 memory of her? What are the things she loved? What are the things she hated? Favorite music? Hated music. Loved pickles, like, weird things. Like, let's make sure we're celebrating all these weird random things that you loved about that person, because when her best friend shows up, her sisters and brothers show up, they'll be like, "Oh my god, pickles. She freaking loved pickles." You know what I mean? Like, that's tradition enough. Like, why don't we just celebrate the parts of life that they loved? It doesn't need to be soaked in any cultural or religious tradition per se, unless that still speaks to you, right? Like, I hope that we can my kids continue Qingming to some degree, right? They don't need to come and light incense wherever my remains will be, but I certainly hope they bring, like, mac and cheese and come visit me every now and then and just eat that, right? Eat that and play Blink-182 records on a boombox. Like, I don't, you know what I mean? Like, that's what I think people need to think of. And also, traditions I find are very helpful right after a death. So if you are going to, like, a traditional funeral of someone who passed away within 7 to 14 days, having those traditions and those guidelines and those patterns can help a person through that type of celebration. Whereas a celebration of life, more often than not, is being had weeks, months, sometimes years after a death. So where you are in your grief cycle is going to kind of dictate and determine how it is that you want to proceed with different traditions or different types of celebrations at that time, just because you've gone through more of it, you've sat with it longer, you've had more conversations. So the time of death is also a huge component to how people will lean into tradition. I hope hopefully I answered that. I feel like I can go on tangents about this.
No, it's great, but it's true though, because my grandfather what was kinda playing in my head, my grandfather passed last August, so we're coming up on a year this summer. And the idea of traditions, again, my grandmother, she passed a few years just before the pandemic and, very, again, religious and so it was a full on, like I don't know if they're considered a mass at that because I don't know how it works, it's like it was a full on Catholic church and, very traditional in that way. And, for my grandfather, he supported her in that, but he personally wasn't very religious, and so his was much more, in terms of that tradition, toned down, but it was still and the idea of, the timing, right? Because it moves very quickly when you're trying to tie it into those, like, 7 to 14 days. And it's a lot, like,
It's a lot.
I've watched my parents go through that with their parents and just the process of coordinating everything, and if you if their parents weren't on the ball enough and organized enough or chose anything, then you're left with all these decisions, and somebody's gotta be the point person and figure it
You
out,
got
and
it.
it's like, "Oh my god."
Mhm.
It's almost like a time clock starts as
Yeah.
soon as there is a death of some sort,
Yeah.
right? Whether it's planned or not planned, there is a clock that starts that now you have to somehow figure all these things out that for the most part, people rarely have experience doing, or if they do,
Correct.
they don't do it very often,
Yep.
right? All of a sudden, you have to figure all of these things out, and it kinda ties into that idea of tradition, like you said, is like, what is it that they wanted to do? What is it that they who they were that they prefer to do that they would want as a celebration of some sort, and try to find a way to kind of mix that in, or trying a way to put that in. And I'm assuming that Awake kind of helps with that scenario, because you mentioned you are, are creating traditions in and of itself, but also trying to, I'm assuming, some form of assimilation with what is that the person was before, and then just trying to fit that in, right? But how do you deal with that concept of that, like you said, that rush, or that schedule, that to try and how does that work, I guess?
Yeah, so the my number one piece of advice, and again, there's incredible funeral home partners all throughout the province. Amanda actually happens to be a certified funeral, pre-planner, although not currently practicing. But I would say, and again, it's one thing to say and another thing to do, but in order to help your future self, or future of some of the loved ones that are in your family, pre-planning would be my number one thing for people to look into. People don't, because, like we discussed, the conversation of death just doesn't sit well with most people in their stomachs, even when we start to think about these things. But what I can say with a planning background and being extremely type A is that how I know I've felt better, and many of our clients do too, when you have pre planned this. Because what is the scariest thing about death? The unknown. So let's take away some of those unknown variables, right? And it's as simple as, here's where all my passwords for all of my bank accounts are located, right? Like, simple
Yep.
as that, to I would like to be cremated, or I would like a traditional burial, or I'd like a natural burial. This is why, right? Because for us to all know that in advance, which people don't actually realize, is even though this could be in your will, 95% of the time your will isn't read until like, disposition and interment has happened. So it happens all the time when they're like, "Shit, the grandpa wanted to be cremated." You know what I mean? Like, these things aren't known unless we've had the conversation, right? And there's a mix of knowing what it is that your loved ones would have wanted for themselves so that you can honor that, and then also realizing that it's like, okay, let's talk about grandma, for example. She was a traditionalist. She felt like she wanted to be memorialized through a church service. She wanted a traditional casket burial. Great. These might have been things that you guys don't necessarily connect with, but that doesn't mean that you guys can't then do a celebration of life in the fall at the cottage where you have the most memories with grandma, right? You have to realize that it's a strange balancing act between how you think they would have wanted to be remembered, and then how each of you, and I say you as in, like, family, close friends, how you would like to celebrate and how that would best help your grief journey, right? So, through Awake, because we have an events background, I'll the first thing I'll do is a consultation, which can be as short or long as you want, but I love listening to every single crazy story about your loved one. The good, the bad, and the ugly, right? We sit there, we laugh, and then we pick things out of that. Well, it's like, based on this conversation, it sounds like, they really loved these hobbies. They really loved to do these things, and they really hated some of this stuff. But, like, how can we use that and incorporate it to how your event smells, feels, what you can hear while you're there? Like, all of those different senses will come and bring those memories back to the people that are there to celebrate. So, if you're able to pre-plan at all, at least those components that no one wants to deal with. Like, we've picked a funeral home, we've picked the urn, like, all of those things even, you feel better about it. You're like, "Oh, I've done that. It's one less thing for my kids to have to deal with when I'm gone." So, pre-planning, although scary because none of us grew up, well, I'll say not none of us. The majority of us did not grow up with our parents or grandparents having this conversation with us.
Mm-mm.
But it
Mhm.
doesn't mean that we cannot start now.
Yep. I love that idea too of, that balance of respecting the wishes of the person who has passed, but also incorporating the way that you would want to interact with them potentially continuously through the rest of your life and,
Exactly.
keep them I think that's really cool.
Well, that's
Yeah.
kinda what I took away from as you were talking. I was thinking about it, it made a lot of sense. Is like, I usually pick, and maybe this is my lack of knowledge, of all the little things that, can happen, I guess, in the bereavement industry, but I always thought a celebration of life being just an alternative to, I guess, the other more traditional aspects of interring someone, if you will, right? Um, and I'd never thought about the concept of a celebration of life being how I want to celebrate, or how we as a family,
Mm.
want to celebrate this person. So we have like, this is what we do to, pay the final respects of the person that has passed. But then there's a celebration, or they can be a celebration of life for how we would want to celebrate this person and remember them.
Mhm.
And, I guess going back to the idea of the grieving process, right? Almost like putting a final period in that sentence of, this is who they were, and we are remembering them
Mhm.
this way, and it's a happy thing, and or it's a,
Yeah.
uh, a more colorful, right, more joyful
Yeah.
thing.
'Cause
Yeah.
I think too, in terms of, like, death in general, I feel like at this point, we're speaking about it as if it happens when we've lived our entire lives and you've had your full life, but there are instances, as tragic as they are, where people pass much sooner. So
Mhm.
the ability to continue to celebrate them, I think is a really it's a really cool way to start looking at death and that I don't know, including it in your life more than people do now, so
Yeah, absolutely, and I think I can you bring up a very good point in terms of, like, how again, there is no box that you need to fit in. I'd say maybe close to half, maybe more of the celebrations of life that I have been a part of, uh, were either a delayed celebration, so they just decided to not have a funeral at that point in time and then had a celebration of life later, or they had the funeral and just at that point, more often than not, they chose, cremation. So they have the ashes now. They've gone through the funeral, they've done the wake, which definitely had their part in their grief cycle, right? Having that immediately after death. But now they've had these ashes for 6 months to a year, and now the siblings are trying to decide, do we split them up? Do we bury them? Do we scatter them? What is it that we do? And then you have that just kind of opens the floodgates to different memories that maybe you had 6 months to a year ago when you had the funeral. So it does become more of a celebratory thing. And again, it's different with different cultures too, like, even with, the Chinese, when my grandfather died, he died young, like, he died in his, like, 50s, 60s. So we looked at traditional sense, looked at his death as a tragedy, whereas my grandmother died in her 80s. So it was already a celebration, right? Like, she lived a long and healthy life. So you can't really take one map for each individual because, like you said, in each circumstance, each situation is so very different. But I think in June, you actually summarized that very well, my blurbs, is that you are looking to balance your celebration, how you feel and how you want to engage and how you decide to live your life moving forward and how that connection with that person will continue as you move forward. And then you have their wishes. Again, all very important at different stages in different times. So, yeah, it's a juggle.
Very interesting. And as we're talking about pre-planning, and I kind of have, trying to tie it in with things, but when it comes to pre-planning, does a wake help with the idea of pre-planning? And um, something that I started thinking about, as I was talking about, was I don't know enough about the industry or the death, what happens after death? What are the things that I need to do? Because I haven't experienced having to create, you know, call for a funeral for somebody that is close to me. I haven't had that chance yet. So I guess for people that haven't gone through it, in terms of helping them pre-plan or think about that scenario, talking about death more openly, but what are the steps, or kind of just overview, what does that look like when something happens, right? Where there is a death of a family member or something like that, and what do you do? Like, what are just the steps for people to kinda get their, head around? Because I personally don't know enough.
There's a couple, pieces to that question. So, from, like, a pre-planning perspective, there's a few things that we do at Awake. So, like, we can actually help consult with, "This is how we want to put together our celebration," and then work directly with the funeral home for those, like, prepayments to happen. So, for example, we also have these at-home scattering kits that you can only get through funeral homes. But we've had many clients reach out to be like, "We want to definitely use Awake's Let Your Love Go product when I go. I'm currently working with my lawyer on my will. How can we get that set up so that as soon as this happens, we have a number in our will for our kids to call, and then it all comes through the funeral home." So, there's ways that we can help you with the planning of those, like, very specific aspects to death, with some of our funeral home partners, which is great. So because they have the entire background on, if someone passed away at home, how the body itself would be transferred, then the conversations as to what you choose for disposition, we lean heavily on our funeral home partners for that. Again, Amanda does have the license, just not practicing, so she has a much greater knowledge as to all of the things that you can pre-plan for, and then we just work with our funeral home partners to lock that in so that if there's a legal document, you've paid X amount of dollars towards it, and then you know that that's locked in and you won't be have to pay more, when the time comes. The second part was, I know that you were talking about, like, what are the steps, right? If when you experience death. And I'm sure that you're meaning the things that happen in the hospital for good and bad reasons. They can help hold your hand a lot when it comes to those types of things. Um, Having been the first call for a couple people is a very humbling experience because you don't quite know if that person has had the conversations as to the questions I'm going to be asking them. So again, your first call, um, in Ontario at least, would be to a funeral home, and they would help you with the conversations as to what disposition method you are looking at. So for anyone who doesn't know what that means, it's more so what would you like to do with the body? Are we looking at a burial? And then at that sense, is it your traditional casket burial with a cement liner and a lacquered casket? Or are you looking for options for a cemetery that has natural burial options where you're actually wrapped in a shroud and you don't go through the embalming process? So it's actually natural, right? That's nature's closest way to bring our body back to earth. Or are you looking at cremation, aquamation, which is basically the water form of cremation? There's not a lot of that in Ontario, but they're becoming more popular. And there will be other forms of disposition too, such as we refer to it as, when you, like, make your body into, like, a mulch, right? So there's all these things that are coming up in the industry. So that'll be basically the first question, and then they'll work with you on transportation logistics, and then helping you find if you have chosen some type of interment, which is where the remains will go, and that's usually a burial. If you've chosen that, they will help you find the cemetery that best suits what it is that you're looking for. So, this is why I think pre-planning or at least having a thought to this is very important. Um, because a lot of the times, the number of questions that you're gonna get thrown at you, although done very well, because this is what funeral home professionals are professional, it's a lot. So, in my mind, and then let's take money away from it completely because there's costs associated with all of these things also. I find that a lot of people, unless they have it written out and know exactly what their loved one wants, they'll pick cremation because they just want some time. Like, holy cow, like, there's just so many questions. I don't know what cemetery to go to. I don't know if it's gonna be in a cemetery, all of those things. So cremation ends up being a very good option for people who just wanna hit pause, right? Like, we just experienced the death. I'm having this conversation, trying to hold back tears. Kids are in the other room. There's just so much to do, and let's not even talk about dealing with taxes and the will and all of those other things that are associated with it, and then the money, financial aspect of all of those things. It's like, "Holy cow, I have to make all of these decisions right now on the phone?" Because more often than not, you're not walking into a funeral home, you're probably calling them,
Yeah.
Yeah, true.
right? So, it just further emphasizes that if you can put yourself into that position, and how does that make you feel? Do you want your loved ones to feel the same way? Right? Like, can we just remove a little bit of that entire wave of emotion and stress from a situation that's already like a level 11 out of 10, right? Having to experience the death itself. So, yeah, really, your first call is your funeral home and they will hold your hand and these professionals will talk you through it and walk you through it. But that only does so much if you don't have the answers to their questions.
That's a very good,
Yep.
that's very good to know though, right? Like you said, it only goes so far. If you don't have the answers to those questions, they're not gonna be able to help until you have those answers,
Yeah.
right? And so that we can move forward in the process. So that's, yeah, that's very good information, to have. I think the last thing that I have, and it's something that I've been trying to figure out, I guess the best way to put it in, but I'm just gonna ask. But how do we get people, I guess, to talk about death more openly? We talked about it right in the beginning where there is a lot of, I guess, nuance with talking about death. A lot of people, it feels funny, it feels weird, like I don't want to talk about it, nobody talks about it. As you being part of the industry that deals with, death in general, like how, from your perspective, how would you approach, I guess, getting people to be more open or speak more freely, in terms of everything, right? Including the pre-planning of this is how I want to go or this is what I want to do with other people.
So you're the third person in an interview type situation to ask me this question. So apparently all of us, pun intended, are dying to have this conversation with people. We just don't know how to do it. Okay.
Mhm.
So there's a few ways to do it. I think the first one for those who have children in their lives or, nieces and nephews that you have a comfortable relationship with. I think first and foremost is like, let's get to them young so that they never have to have a conversation in their mid 30s to mid 50s about how they have this conversation. Right? So my son is 5, okay? There's loads of things that I leave out of these conversations with him, but enough to satisfy his curiosity. He unfortunately one of his classmates experienced the loss of their mother. So we're talking and again, this happens. This is life. So when I look back, it was funny, I was talking to my husband, I said, "I can't remember a single time before high school where I'm sure every single person I had known had experienced a death, that I ever heard of it, that it was ever talked about, that it was ever discussed. They just weren't at school for a certain period of time, and then they were back." Thankfully, his teachers were incredible with how they handled the situation, and death is something that should be talked about, in my opinion. So, with my son and I've shared this with other friends who have unfortunately had, like, grandparents die, and now their kids are like, "Well, where's grandpa?" Right? So, like, we have to have these conversations, finding a way to do so with the younger ones so that they can, at one point in time, help the older ones of that generation. That's really where we're at. So, when it comes to us having those conversations with, like, our partners, our friends, and our parents, to be completely honest with you, and this isn't me just pumping the podcast, but, like, tell them that you watched this podcast about death and it got you thinking about your own. And I think
Mhm.
that's the easiest way to start this
Mhm.
conversation. So, when I talk to my parents, it's not like, "Hey, dad, what do you want me to do with your body when you die?" It's like, "Hey, dad, I actually had a really good conversation about how I want you people to deal with me if I died tomorrow." Right? So if you make it about yourself and the things that you've thought about and the things that you've researched, it's so much easier for the person that you are talking to be like, "Oh, I never thought of that," or "No, I actually want to do this." It's like, "Oh, well, I never knew that about you." Right? So I think that if you do the work yourself It's gonna make your conversations with your parents, with your aunts, your uncles, your brother and sister so much easier because I am fairly confident it'll be one of 2 things. They actually have put a lot of thought into it and just have never talked to you about it, or they've put 0 thought into it. So if you asked them that question, they'd have no idea how to answer you. So I think that it's a matter of us, realizing all now, number 1, our cemeteries and our funeral homes are here to serve us, right? And they're really good at what they do, but if there's, changes in the traditions, in the spaces, in the how the celebrations are done, they won't implement or look for different ways to do that if their clientele isn't telling them that's what they want. That's how Awake has gotten to where we have gotten in the last even just like 6 months, is because people are reaching out to their cemeteries saying, "We need green solutions. We need this. We want naturalized spaces. We want places where our kids can come visit." And because of that, the cemeteries are listening, right? It's not because they're just sitting there not doing it because they don't feel like it. It's because no one's brought it to their attention. So it's same thing with everything in life. I feel like as a collective, you kind of just need to start planting these seeds. So that's a very long-winded answer to, I think if you put a little thought behind it, then in your conversation with whomever it is that you feel like having it with will be so much smoother. I totally get that there's those people in your life that they don't even wanna talk to you about, you know, what happened in high school that one time. Like, they're just like, they're not the ones to discuss anything personal, and maybe that's where you end up putting your stuff in writing. You say, "Hey, like, this is something that I'm actually gonna get my lawyer to throw into my living will. Like, would you mind, like, just taking a read over it?" Maybe some people just wanna read and digest and come back to you in a different way. But I would push the podcast. I remember I just had a conversation with, a Chinese news network, which is really cool, I'm hoping both my grandparents from the other side are very proud of me as they dubbed me into Cantonese. But she asked me the same question. She's like, "How the heck did you have this conversation with your po?" Like, there's no way. I said, "Why don't you just send her this?" She's like, "I'm gonna send her this interview for sure." Right? Because then it's like, it's far enough removed that you can have the conversation without being too internally attached to yourself at that point. Is that helpful?
It is,
Yeah.
yeah, because it's true, and we've experienced it with our own parents, and, it's just it's almost like sometimes there's that fear that you're welcoming death before you're ready kinda thing, so you don't wanna, like, entice it or jinx it, so it's a fear and it's a concern, and I get that. It's like we said, it's uncomfortable and it's weird to talk about, for my grandfather, we had the tombstone prepped when my grandmother passed, and it was just kind of a blank space for him for when it was his time, and, I remember my dad asking if they wanted to start like, put his birth date on there and just leave the like, his death date blank, and he was like, "No, that's that's weird." Like, you're just waiting waiting for me.
Yeah. Well, and there is superstition and those sorts of things locked in to these conversations, and I'm not gonna say that it's directly tied to this because, of course, there's religions and cultures that have many different beliefs, right? So, like, that aside, which is its own thing, completely understandable. But I think a lot, or at least some of these things that you've discussed where it's just like, "Oh, like, don't speak it into existence," is because we are a death-denying society, and because we do not speak about death. And that's not the same way across different cultures, right? So, there are so many cultures across this beautiful planet that have the most incredible ways to commemorate and celebrate their dead. Let's talk about Day of the Dead, for example,
Yep.
right? Like,
Sure.
there's the whole notion in, well, it's science, energy can neither be created nor destroyed, right? We're surrounded by it. That's why when I had the conversation with my son, I use the pot of boiling water on the stove to explain death, where it's the pot is our body, the water is our soul. What's happening to the water? Well, he's like, "Well, it's boiling it and then it's leaving the pot, and now the pot's empty." This is what happens when we die. Our soul no longer needs the pot. I said, "But did the water just is it gone? Like, has it just disappeared?" He goes, "No, it evaporated. It's all around us." I said, "Exactly. right? So we just need to find the right way, the right message, depending on who it is that we're talking to, inserting what their beliefs and their very, very important systems are. And I think it's just a matter of turning the page. Like, I'm hoping that for all the kids born past 2020, it's like, yeah, me and my mom talked about death ages ago. I know exactly what she wants to do with her and this, and I've talked about this and what it does to the environment and all these sorts of things. It's just we got to start now. It's unfortunately it's on our shoulders to have these conversations.
Yep,
Yeah.
it is.
No, it makes a lot of sense, and it's something that, I can only speak to myself, but it would have been nice to have talked about it, right, growing up, like, to be able to understand it better, to be able to because you are surrounded by death, as you said, it's part of life, right, regardless of what happens, right? Whether it's family members or it's friends or things happen,
Yeah,
right? Like,
pets,
yeah,
you know,
pets, I've
plants, like,
yeah,
it's just a
exactly.
natural yeah.
It's a natural cycle of life, and to be able to, I guess, just have a little bit of a better grasp on it, it just makes it simpler to maneuver around it,
Mhm,
right? Because like you said, even just as simple as pets pass away, plants
yeah.
pass away, things happen. It's part of you have to be able to understand it even from a young age in that sense.
Well, yeah, it's crazy to think that I can't think of another thing that we will have to deal with or interact with in life that we could just close our eyes and pretend doesn't exist, right? Like this is inevitable, death and taxes, right? Like it's going to happen, and it is crazy to think that some people will go their entire lives without ever having a conversation about it. Of course it's scary. You haven't once discussed it.
Yeah.
The
Mhm.
unknown is terrifying.
Yeah.
The first time you went to the dentist, you thought you were gonna die because that's how scary it was because you had no idea. Now we're all middle-aged and going to the dentist is a whatever thing because right? You've experienced it so many times. So, it's just we just gotta stop denying it. It's here, whether we want it to be or not.
It's
Yeah.
coming.
Great point. That's true. So for people that want to learn more about Awake and, um, pre-plan
Yeah.
their celebrations and whatnot, where could they go? What's your website or social media handles, stuff like that?
So, they can, of course, send us an email to info@awakecanada.com. We are trying our best to be more, involved with social media, so Amanda and I are actually hopefully soon we'll be able to share this, having, like, a founder's perspective only where we showcase a lot of these conversations and things that are not directly tied to the business, but we're on, awake.ashes on Instagram, awake.ceremony for all those that are more interested in the ceremony aspects of our business, and then you can reach us at awakeashes.com.
Very cool.
Awesome. Well, if there is nothing else that we'd like to talk about or anything else that you'd like to kind of mention, I would think that would be it for the podcast.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that we might have missed, you think? Or
I just would like to say thank you for having the conversation about death and bringing it to your viewership because um, the more people are having these conversations now, the easier it is for my job to help people actually get what they need to out of these special milestone moments, not just checking off things that have to be done, right? So we can actually look at what is it that you want to get out of this celebration or what do you want to get out of this memorialization? How are you going to continue to honor them throughout the rest of your life? And how can we work on ensuring those things are done versus did we pay this, talk to this person, check off where they're going to be, has all these operational stuff, the stuff that no one wants to deal with is done. Now we can just work on you, right? So yeah, no, I think that we covered a lot, and I'm sure this is gonna be, a lot of information for a lot of people to digest, so
It's so fascinating. Like, I have so many questions, and I'm like, "No, it's gonna take hours."
I know, like, I would delve into every little thing.
Yeah.
I still think the metaphysics,
So cool.
so cool. Really interesting to talk about that. But anyways,
the only thing that I would mention, though, for people who do want more, one of the best places that they can go for more information is, a death cafe. They happen like, you can just Google, like, "Bury Death Cafe," Aurelia Death Cafe, and see what's in the area where you'll get a lot of people that are part of the industry, like different areas, death doulas, funeral representatives, people like me and Amanda, celebrants. And it's a place for people to come and either engage or just sit and watch. They don't have to necessarily partake, but it's a room full of people that are comfortable to ask questions, just like what we did here. What do I do, with, like, things like MAID, right? The medical assistance in dying, right? There's all of these sorts of questions for people at different stages of pre-planning or because they had a bad experience with a death, how they can make sure that that doesn't happen again. All of these things, there are a lot of us out there wanting the questions answered, so death cafes is a really good resource, is the only thing that I'd wanna mention.
Very
There you go.
interesting.
See,
Yeah.
I didn't know about
I
that.
don't yeah. That's
Maybe
really
we can
cool.
host one day.
I would love
Yeah.
to. I know this is like this is so I don't know. I'm just so interested. Cuz I'm like it's so interesting that pre-planning aspect of it too, right? And I'm just like, "Huh."
Yeah, absolutely. But anyways, thank you very much, Lauren, for being on the podcast, and, I hope, you come back so we can talk more about this
Anytime, you guys are fun.
fascinating topic.
Yeah,
But yeah, awesome.
Thanks,
cool.
guys.
Thank you for listening to the entire episode. All the links and info you heard in this conversation will be featured in the show notes on our website, villagermagazine.ca/podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing to our channels like YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you're listening from, so you never miss an episode. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.